The dome-shaped structures rose from the white Alberta prairie like ancient burial mounds, their curves softened by 2 feet of fresh snow that had fallen in the hours before dawn. Nothing moved in the pre-dawn darkness, no wind, no sound. Just the pale grey light of a winter morning struggling to break through storm clouds that stretched from horizon to horizon. Then movement. A cow's head emerged from an opening in the largest mound, steam rising from her nostrils in the -20 air. She stepped out onto the snow, calm and unhurried, and began grazing on hay scattered near the entrance. Behind her, 31 more cattle followed, one by one, their coats dry and their eyes clear, showing none of the wild-eyed panic that usually followed a night of extreme cold. This should have been impossible. 48 hours earlier, every rancher in Clearwater County had been bracing for the worst winter storm in living memory. 48 hours earlier, Garrett Thorne had been the laughingstock of the entire region, building what his neighbors called monuments to madness, from hay bales and mathematical precision. Now his cattle were the only ones still standing. But to understand how a man becomes willing to bet everything on structures that look like they belong in the Arctic rather than the Canadian prairie, you have to go back. Not just days, but years, decades. You have to go back to the moment when everything Garrett Thorne loved turned to dust in his hands, and he had to choose between dying with the old ways or learning to build something new from the ruins. 2 days earlier, December 21, 2025. The sun had not yet broken the horizon when Garrett Thorne began his work. His breath formed clouds in the pre-dawn darkness as he positioned the first hay bale of the morning, setting it with the mathematical precision he had used for every bale that came before. The growing structure already stood 8 feet tall, its curved walls rising in a spiral that would eventually form a perfect dome. 45 years old, widowed, alone on 40 acres with 32 head of cattle and a plan that everyone thought would kill them all. From the road, pickup trucks slowed. Drivers stared. A few pulled out phones to photograph the spectacle. By noon, the images would be circulating through the coffee shops and feed stores of Clearwater County, proof that Garrett Thorne had finally completely lost his mind. He noticed none of this. His attention remained fixed on the angle of each bale, exactly 47 degrees to the one below the compression rate between layers, the way each piece locked into the next, to create a structure that would either save everything or prove every doubter right. His hands were bleeding. The rope had cut through his work gloves hours ago, leaving raw wounds that he wrapped in electrical tape and ignored. Pain was temporary. Failure was permanent, and he had already failed once 2 years ago in ways that still woke him screaming in the dark. Never again. Marcus Herricks stood at his fence line across the road, coffee mug steaming in his weathered hands. At 58, Marcus had been ranching this land longer than Garrett had been alive. He was president of the Clearwater County Ranchers Association. When he spoke about proper methods, people listened. When he recommended winter preparations, insurance companies offered discounts. But standing there watching Garrett build the hay igloos, Marcus felt something he rarely experienced: doubt. "Man's lost his mind," Marcus muttered, but the conviction in his voice was weaker than it should have been. His own barn stood solid and traditional, behind him reinforced last month with new support beams, heating lamps installed, extra ventilation, everything the association recommended, everything except the certainty that it would be enough. The weather radio on Marcus's porch had been broadcasting warnings for 3 days. A polar vortex was descending from the Arctic, bringing temperatures that hadn't been recorded in Alberta since the catastrophic winter of 1972. Wind chills expected to reach -50. Livestock advisories in effect across 4 provinces. Every responsible rancher was taking precautions. And then there was Garrett Thorne, building what looked like oversized doghouses from hay bales, following blueprints that existed only in his grief-scarred mind. Dr. Linnea Hartwell's veterinary truck rolled up Garrett's driveway just after 7. She had been making early rounds, checking herds before the storm hit. Garrett's property was her last stop, and she had been dreading it. She had known him for 15 years, had treated his cattle through every season, had attended his wedding to Sarah back when the world seemed full of ordinary happiness, had stood beside him at Sarah's funeral 2 years ago, watching him stare at the casket with eyes that looked already dead. She had never seen him prepare for winter like this. Linnea stepped out of her truck boots, crunching on frost-hardened ground. Garrett was wrestling a 60-pound bale into position on the structure's western wall, his movements deliberate despite the weight. He wore no gloves, now just bloody hands, wrapped in tape, working with the single-minded focus of a man who had nothing left to lose. "Morning, Garrett." He paused, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the near-zero temperature. His face was thinner than she remembered, the lines around his eyes deeper. 2 years of grief had carved themselves into his features, leaving him looking a decade older than 45. "Linnea, didn't expect you this early. Got a call about Westridge's horses. Thought I'd stop by." She gestured toward the largest dome, now standing 12 feet high. Never seen anything quite like this. Garrett's expression closed like a door slamming shut. Desperate times. "Where did you learn to build these?" For a long moment, he simply stared at the structure, then at the darkening sky, where storm clouds gathered like an approaching army. When he spoke, his voice carried weight that made Linnea step closer. "My grandfather. But that's not the whole story." He pulled a photograph from his shirt pocket. Worn edges, creases from being folded and unfolded 1,000 times. A young boy and an old man standing beside a crude hay dome, both smiling, though the old man's eyes held knowledge of catastrophes the boy couldn't yet imagine. "Ezra Thorne," Garrett said quietly. "My grandfather. He has survived the winter of 72 using structures like these. Lost everything, first 140 head of cattle, his barn, his savings. Everything except the willingness to learn from people everyone else ignored." Before Linnea could respond, another truck pulled in. Marcus Hicks climbed out, his face already red with more than cold. "Thorne, we need to talk." Marcus Hicks was not a man accustomed to being ignored. As president of the Clearwater County Ranchers Association, his word carried weight. When he spoke about proper methods, people listened. But Garrett Thorne wasn't listening. "What in blazes are you doing?" Marcus's voice cut across the frozen morning. "You've got 32 head of cattle depending on proper shelter, and you're out here playing with oversized hay bales like it's some kind of science experiment." Garrett set down his bale. He wiped his bleeding hands on his jeans, leaving dark streaks. When he looked at Marcus, his eyes held something that might have been pity. "They'll have shelter. Better shelter than your cattle will have." "Better shelter." Marcus's laugh was harsh. "Son, I've been ranching this land since before you were born. Cattle need walls, roofs, heat sources. They don't need hay igloos that'll collapse the first time real wind hits." Snow had started falling. Fat, heavy flakes that stuck to everything. Linnea watched how the flakes hit the dome's curved surface and slid away, following mathematical angles Garrett had built into every layer. "Show him the inside." Linnea suggested, curiosity overriding caution. Garrett hesitated. His hand moved to his shirt pocket where the photograph pressed against his chest. Then he walked to the nearest dome and pulled aside what appeared to be solid wall but revealed itself as a carefully constructed door. The three of them peered inside. The interior was larger than it appeared from outside. Hay walls curved inward, creating a natural insulation chamber. But more impressive were Garrett's modifications. A network of ventilation pipes ran through walls at precise intervals. The floor was covered with reflective material that would trap and redirect heat upward. The ceiling peaked at exactly 14 feet, creating a chamber where warm air could rise and circulate through channels built into the hay itself. "This is madness," Marcus whispered, but uncertainty crept into his voice. "My grandfather survived the winter of 72 using structures like these," Garrett said quietly, "but he built them smaller, cruder. I have been improving the design for 2 years. 2 years, Linnea's medical mind calculated. You've been planning this since... She stopped. They all knew what had happened 2 years ago, what winter had taken from Garrett Thorne. Garrett nodded toward the horizon where storm clouds built with unnatural speed. Weather patterns are changing. Traditional methods won't be enough anymore. Climate change nonsense. Marcus scoffed, but his heart wasn't in it. We've had bad winters before. We've always gotten through them the right way. The right way bankrupted 17 ranchers last winter. Garrett's voice was soft but cut like a blade. The right way left Johnson's cattle dying when his heating system failed. The right way killed my wife when our barn collapsed on her while she was checking on a cow in labor. The silence that followed was broken only by wind, picking up carrying an edge of cold that cut through their heavy coats. Linnea pulled out her phone. The weather app was updating in real time. Forecast just got worse. They're predicting the storm hits tonight, 12 hours earlier than expected. That's when they heard it, the distant crack and rumble of a barn roof collapsing under rapidly accumulating snow. Flashback winter 2023. The memory came to Garrett unbidden, as it always did, when temperature dropped and wind began to howl. Sarah standing in the doorway of their traditional barn calling to him across the yard. Snow had been falling for 6 hours, wind picking up, nothing catastrophic, nothing their barn reinforced just 2 years prior couldn't handle. That's what he had believed. Sarah was checking on Bess, a Hereford in early labor, making sure heating lamps were positioned correctly, ensuring water troughs hadn't frozen. All the things a good rancher's wife does when winter comes to Alberta. Garrett had been in the house monitoring weather radio when he heard the crack. Not loud, not dramatic. Just a sharp sound that didn't belong, followed by Sarah's scream cut suddenly short. He ran through knee-deep snow, his heart hammering. The barn's main support beam had split under accumulated snow and ice. Not enough to bring down the whole structure, but enough to drop a section of roofing directly onto where Sarah had been standing. She died instantly. That's what the medical examiner said. No pain, no suffering. Just there one moment, and gone the next, buried under timber and metal and the weight of winter itself. 3 cattle died with her. The rest survived, rescued by neighbors who came running. But Garrett stood in the ruins, holding his wife's hand, as snow continued to fall, and something inside him broke more completely than any support beam. In the months that followed, people said he lost himself to grief. That isolation was making him strange. That he needed to move on, rebuild the traditional way. They didn't understand. Garrett wasn't lost. He was searching for the knowledge that could have saved her. Flashback, summer 1993. Young Garrett Thorne was 10 years old, the summer his grandfather Ezra taught him to build his first hay igloo. The summer was unusually cool, and Ezra had decided it was time to pass on knowledge most men would dismiss as desperate improvisation. They worked in the field behind the old barn, the one Ezra rebuilt after the catastrophe of 72. Garrett's hands were small, then struggling with bales that weighed nearly as much as he did. But Ezra was patient in the way old men who have survived the unsurvivable learn to be. Every bale has to lock with the one below it. Ezra explained, his voice rough from decades of prairie wind. Not just stacked, locked, like fingers interlaced. You're not building a wall, boy. You're building a living thing that breathes and flexes and gets stronger when wind tries to knock it down. Dad says this is crazy talk, young Garrett said, parroting what he'd heard his father tell his mother in voices that they thought he couldn't hear. Ezra smiled, but there was no humor in it. Your father builds the way his father taught him, the way every rancher builds, because it's how it's always been done. When weather stays normal, that's fine. When winters behave themselves, traditional barns work just fine. But when the world breaks its own rules, boy, you better have knowledge that comes from people who survived the breaking. Ezra positioned another bale, movements sure despite arthritis gnarling his fingers. Winter of 72 taught me that everything I knew was worth less than nothing when temperature dropped low enough. I lost 140 head in 5 days, lost my barn, lost my savings, Lost everything except pride, and I was ready to lose that too. Young Garrett watched his grandfather's face, seeing something there he didn't yet have words for. Pain. But also something harder. Something that looked like wisdom earned in blood and failure. That's when Tulimak found me. Old Inuit man, working seasonal jobs down south, heading back north before winter. He saw me standing in the ruins with nowhere left to go. Ezra paused, lost in memory. He said, "You build for the world you want. We build for the world that is." What does that mean? Means I spent the next 2 winters living with his family 300 miles north, learning to survive where -40 is called Tuesday. Learning that ice and snow aren't enemies to fight, they're forces to work with, to use. Ezra tapped the growing dome. Igloos aren't just shelters, boy. They're proof that the hardest thing in the world can become the thing that saves you if you know how to shape it right. Young Garrett ran his hand along the curved wall, feeling how each bale pressed against the next, creating tension that held everything together. Did it work when you came back? Worked well enough that I survived the next bad winter. And the one after that, your father was born in a house I built with money from cattle that lived through weather that killed everyone else's herds. Ezra's eyes grew distant, but I stopped teaching these methods after a while. People thought I was crazy. They wanted barns that looked like barns. Eventually I gave them what they wanted. Then why teach me? Ezra placed his weathered hand on young Garrett's shoulder. The weight felt like an anchor. Because someday, boy, you're going to face a winter that breaks all the rules. And when that day comes, I want you to remember that surviving isn't about doing what everyone else does. It's about doing what works even when it looks insane. The old man's grip tightened. And Garrett, when that day comes, you're going to want to quit. You're going to want to do it the easy way, the normal way. But I need you to promise me something. Ganawatin, promise me you'll remember that the people you love are worth more than the opinions of people who don't understand. Promise me you'll build what needs building, even if it makes you look like a fool. 10-year-old Garrett promised. 35 years later, standing in the ruins of a barn that killed his wife, he remembered. Present day, December 21st, 2025. The memory faded as Garrett stood in his field, watching Marcus and Linnea examine the hay dome with expressions of skeptical fascination. His grandfather had been dead 12 years, buried in Clearwater County Cemetery next to a modest headstone that said nothing about igloos or Inuit teachers or surviving the unsurvivable. But Ezra's lessons lived in these structures, in the mathematical precision of every angle, in Garrett's raw bleeding hands, in his absolute certainty that traditional methods would fail when temperature dropped to -47. "I need to finish this," Garrett said. "Storms coming faster than predicted." Marcus opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. Something in Garrett's face made argument seem pointless. Instead, he pulled out his phone and called his foreman, barking orders about reinforcing barn support beams one more time. Linnea lingered, watching Garrett return to work with single-minded focus that seemed inhuman. "Garrett," she said softly, "have you talked to anyone about Sarah?" He positioned another bale. "I talk to her every day." "That's not what I mean." "I know what you mean." His hands never stopped moving. "But grief counselors can't teach me how to keep cattle alive in -50-degree weather. Sarah can't come back. All I can do is make sure no one else loses what I lost because they trusted in methods that don't work anymore." Linnea wanted to argue, wanted to insist he see someone professional. But before she could find words, her phone buzzed with an emergency alert. "Severe weather warning. Historic winter storm approaching. Wind chills to reach -50 degrees. All livestock should be sheltered immediately." "It's here," Linnea whispered. On the northern horizon, the sky had turned the color of old bruises. Wind was beginning to howl with a sound like grief itself. In 12 hours, Clearwater County would be tested in ways it hadn't been tested since 1972. And somewhere in the middle of 40 acres, surrounded by hay domes that looked like ancient monuments, Garrett Thorne positioned the final bale on his largest structure. His 32 head of cattle watched from the field, calm and trusting. They had better instincts than the men who doubted their caretaker. By nightfall, they would know which instincts to follow. The sound came from the Richardson property half a mile east. A barn roof collapsing under weight of snow that was accumulating faster than anyone predicted. Linnea grabbed her veterinary bag without hesitation. Marcus followed earlier bravado, replaced by genuine concern. Garrett stood motionless, staring at his completed domes. His cattle were as safe as he could make them. But Callum Westridge had 20 head in a barn already 30 years old, and if something was wrong, he climbed into his truck and pointed it east, toward the sound of catastrophe beginning, toward the moment when theory would become brutal, undeniable truth. The storm was 12 hours early, and it was just getting started. The first snowflakes began falling at 2 in the afternoon, 12 hours ahead of forecast. They came down hard and fast, not gentle drifting flakes, but dense wind-driven ice crystals that stung exposed skin like thrown sand. Within 20 minutes, visibility dropped to less than a quarter mile. Within an hour, the world had turned white. Garrett stood in the entrance of his largest hay dome, watching his 32 head file inside one by one. They moved without panic, some ancient instinct telling them this curved shelter offered something the open field did not. The last cow, Bess, the old Hereford, who had survived Sarah's death, paused at the entrance and looked back at Garrett with dark, knowing eyes. I couldn't save her, Garrett thought, but I can save you. Bess disappeared into the structure's dim interior. Garrett secured the hay bale door, checking ventilation pipes one final time. Temperature had already dropped 15 degrees since morning. Wind was beginning to howl with a sound that made his chest tighten with memories he couldn't afford to revisit. Not now. Not when everything depended on staying focused. His phone buzzed. Text from Linnea. At Westridge Ranch. Barn showing stress. Can you come? Garrett looked at his completed domes solid against driving snow. His cattle were safe. But Callum Westridge had 20 head in a structure built in 1994, and if it was already showing stress, he climbed into his truck. Callum Westridge's barn had survived 29 winters without significant incident. Strong timber frame, metal roofing, adequate ventilation, everything built according to conventional wisdom. But it had never faced snow like this. Garrett arrived to find Linnea's truck already there, emergency lights flashing red against a white landscape. Marcus's truck pulled in behind him, the association president, having monitored the same emergency channels. The sound reached them before they saw damage. A sharp splintering crack that echoed across fields, followed by terrified bellowing of cattle in distress. Callum stood in his driveway, phone pressed to his ear, trying to coordinate with emergency services, already overwhelmed. He was 52, third-generation rancher whose grandfather homesteaded this land in the 20s. His face had gone pale. "Northeast corner," he shouted over wind. Roof came down where they always sheltered during storms. Garrett didn't wait. He ran toward the barn, Marcus and Linnea close behind. Snow was already ankle-deep, accumulating faster than anything Garrett had seen outside old photographs from '72. Wind drove it horizontally, creating drifts that materialized from nothing. The damage was catastrophic. The barn's peaked roof had buckled under snow, piling up at impossible rates. Northeast corner collapsed, completely twisted metal and splintered beams, creating a cage that trapped 4 cattle beneath tons of wreckage. 8 more head had escaped to the far end, but their eyes showed white with panic as snow poured through the gaping hole. How long ago? Linnea was already pulling on veterinary gloves, medical training overriding fear. 10 minutes, maybe less. Callum's voice shook. I was checking weather when I heard it go. Marcus and Garrett began pulling away, twisted metal hands, going numb within seconds, despite heavy gloves. The trapped cattle were alive but struggling their terrified movements, threatening to bring down more unstable structure. One cow had a deep laceration running the length of her flank, blood dark against white coat. Another appeared to have severe shoulder dislocation, the joint visibly out of place. Linnea worked to assess injuries while men cleared debris. We need to get them out, but where rest of your barn isn't safe with this snow load. Callum looked helplessly at what remained of his family's barn. 3 generations of careful maintenance, and it had come apart in less time than it took to drink coffee. I don't know, maybe reinforce the south wall temporarily, maybe bring them to my place, Garrett said quietly. Marcus stared through driving snow. Your hay houses won't hold 52 cattle, Garrett. This isn't the time for experiments. They'll hold 52. They're designed for 60. Garrett was already helping guide the injured cow toward Linnea's truck. And they'll be safer than any patched up barn. The cow fought at first pain and panic, making her unpredictable. But something in Garrett's voice, some quality of absolute assurance, seemed to reach through her fear. Easy now, easy, I've got you. We're going somewhere safe. I promise you're going somewhere safe. Like I promised the Sarah he didn't say. Like I couldn't keep. The next hour was organized chaos. Linnea treated worst injuries in questionable shelter while men loaded cattle into trucks and trailers. Snow was falling so heavily, visibility had dropped to 50 yards. Wind screamed across prairie, with hurricane force driving ice crystals that turned exposed skin raw within minutes. Callum rode with Garrett, skepticism overwhelmed by desperate need to save his herd. He kept looking back at the trailer, counting heads, making sure no one was left behind in wreckage his grandfather built. I've got insurance, he said more to himself than Garrett. But they won't cover everything. If I lose these cattle on top of the barn. He didn't finish. Both men understood the mathematics. Lose your shelter and herd in the same storm, you might as well put a for sale sign in the yard. When they reached Garrett's property, Callum's jaw dropped. Garrett's 32 head had already moved into the domes. Through entrances, they could see animals standing calmly, coats completely dry despite blizzard raging outside. No wild-eyed panic, no desperate crowding, just peaceful cattle chewing cud as if it were an ordinary winter day. How did you get them inside so fast? Marcus asked, arriving with another load. I didn't, Garrett replied, opening the entrance to the largest dome. They moved in on their own when weather turned bad. Cattle have better instincts than people give them credit for. Better instincts than I had, Garrett thought. Sarah told me the barn needed reinforcement. I said it was fine. I was wrong. Linnea watched as they guided Callum's injured cattle toward the structure. Healthy animals followed without resistance, as if sensing safety the strange domes provided. What struck her most was complete absence of wind inside hay walls. The moment they passed through the entrance, howling ceased, replaced by profound silence, broken only by gentle sounds of cattle breathing. The temperature difference was immediate and undeniable. Outside thermometer read -23 and falling. Inside the dome, Linnea could feel warmth on her face rising from cattle themselves, and trapped by curved ceiling Garrett had engineered with mathematical precision. But as the last cow disappeared into the dome, Linnea noticed something that made her pull out her phone with growing concern. Garrett, look at this. Temperature forecast had been revised downward. Again. What was supposed to be severe storm was rapidly becoming something else. Something that hadn't been seen in Alberta since her parents were young. By 6 o'clock that evening, temperature had plummeted to -32 degrees. Wind was howling across prairie with ferocity that rattled windows and bent fence posts at 45-degree angles. Snow had piled so fast that Garrett's truck, parked 50 feet from his farmhouse, was already buried to the wheel wells. Inside the house, 4 humans huddled around the kitchen table, watching weather updates that grew more dire by the hour. Storm had intensified beyond all predictions. Wind chills expected to reach -50 by midnight. Weather Service was calling it a once-in-50-years event. Some meteorologists whispered it might be worse than 72. I need to check on the cattle, Callum said, rising. Guilt of losing his barn was written across his face, and watching his herd disappear into oversized haystacks had done nothing to ease anxiety. I can't just sit here. "They're fine," Garrett assured him. But even he was beginning to feel doubt creep in. Snow was accumulating faster than his grandfather described. Wind was stronger. Everything about this storm exceeded parameters that guided his designs. "You can't know that without checking," Callum insisted. "My animals are my responsibility." Marcus, silent for the past hour, stood as well. "No shelter works in weather like this without heating systems. We should at least verify they're alive." Garrett looked out the kitchen window at the wall of white that had swallowed his world. Somewhere out there, 52 Haid were sheltering in structures he built based on memories and teachings of a dead man and people he'd never met. Somewhere out there, his grandfather's wisdom was either being vindicated or catastrophically disproven. He pulled on his heavy coat, wrapped his bleeding hands in fresh tape. "Then, let's go see for ourselves." The walk to the domes was brutal. Wind drove snow horizontally with such force that breathing became difficult. Garrett led the way, attached to a rope he'd tied to the porch railing, a precaution that now seemed like the only thing keeping them from being swept into white void. Linnea followed close, one hand gripping Garrett's coat, the other holding her medical bag. Behind her came Marcus and Callum, all bent nearly double against wind that threatened to knock them flat with every gust. Visibility was zero. The world had contracted to white noise and stinging ice and the rope that was their only connection to shelter. Garrett counted steps. 53 from house to largest dome. He counted twice to be sure because in a whiteout this complete being off by 10 feet could mean wandering into prairie and freezing before finding your way back. 51, 52, 53. His outstretched hand found hay walls solid and real in screaming chaos. He felt along it until he located the door, pulled it open, ushered the others inside. The silence was shocking. One moment, battered by wind that felt like physical blows. The next, standing in stillness so profound that Linnea could hear her own heartbeat. But even more shocking than silence was the warmth. The interior wasn't just warmer than outside, it was genuinely comfortable. Cattle stood calmly throughout the structure, some lying on beds of clean straw, others chewing cud with expressions of bovine contentment. Steam rose gently from their bodies, but instead of condensing into dampness that would freeze, moisture seemed to circulate through a hay walls and disappear through ventilation. "This is impossible," Marcus whispered, pulling off his gloves in unexpected heat. His breath no longer formed clouds. Temperature inside had to be at least 60 degrees. Callum walked among his cattle, running hands along their flanks, checking for distress or injury. The cow with the lacerated flank was lying peacefully wound, no longer bleeding, eyes clear and calm. The one with dislocated shoulder was standing on all fours, the joint apparently reset by its own struggle or some miracle of reduced stress. "How?" Linnea asked her scientific mind, struggling to reconcile observation with everything she knew. "How is this possible without a heat source?" Garrett knelt beside one of the ventilation pipes running through hay walls. His bleeding hands traced the pipe's path with something approaching tenderness. Hay provides insulation, but that's just beginning. Dome-shaped traps rising warm air and circulates it back down through these channels. Cattle's body heat warms the space each animal generates approximately 1500 BTUs per hour. Multiply that by 52, you've got 78,000 BTUs. That's like running 7 space heaters, assuming you can trap and circulate heat efficiently. He looked up at Linnea. "My grandfather learned it from Inuit traders in the early 70s. They taught him how igloos work with ice. He adapted principles using hay bales. But he never perfected the mathematics. That took me 2 years of obsessive study of nights reading engineering texts and Inuit survival manuals, and Grandpa's handwritten notes. 2 years, Linnea said softly. And that's in Sarah. Since I failed her." Garrett's voice was flat. "Since I trusted conventional wisdom and lost the person who mattered most. I won't make that mistake again." Marcus pulled out his phone, checking messages piling up. His face went pale. "My barn just went down," he said quietly, voice stripped of all authority. "Main support beam failed. Roof collapsed on south side." Your cattle, Linnea asked. Foreman moved them to equipment shed when stress fractures started showing. Lost 43 head, 52 dead out of 120. Marcus looked around the hay dome, really seeing it for first time. 30 years I spent reinforcing that barn. 30 years, following every recommendation. And it lasted less than 6 hours. Outside wind was reaching new levels of fury. Through dome's entrance, they could see snow accumulating at rates that defied belief. Weather radio crackled with emergency broadcasts painting picture of unprecedented destruction. 17 barns collapsed in Clearwater County. Highway 2 impassable. Power grid failed across 4 counties. Emergency services suspended until wind speeds dropped below 40 miles per hour. They were on their own. Linnea pulled out thermal imaging camera from her veterinary kit. She pointed it at dome's interior wall, watching display register temperature that should have been impossible. External wall temperature minus 37 degrees and falling. Internal wall temperature plus 52 degrees. Air temperature 3 feet above cattle plus 61 degrees. I'm going to need you to explain the physics, she said to Garrett, because this shouldn't work. Not like this, not without external heat. Garrett walked to the wall, placed his bleeding hand against hay. Physics are simple. Complexity is in execution. Every bale positioned to create air pockets that trap heat. Dome shape prevents warm air escaping through top, instead redirecting through channels along walls. Ventilation pipes remove moisture without removing heat positioned at specific heights and angles to create airflow that pulls dampness out while keeping warm air in. His voice carried weight of 2 years of obsessive study. 2 years of trying to build something that could have saved Sarah if he'd only known then what he knew now. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Lightning flashed, illuminating snow-filled sky with brief, unnatural brightness. Thunder snow, rare and ominous sign that this storm was feeding on atmospheric conditions that hadn't been present in Alberta for half a century. Callum's phone buzzed with emergency alert. He read it, face going paler. Richardson's place just lost power. Backup generator failed. He's got 40 head in a barn with no heat and temperatures dropping to minus 40. Can he bring them here? Linnea asked. Garrett shook his head. Not in this. Nobody's driving anywhere until wind dies down. Best we can do is spray his barn holes and his cattle bunch together for warmth. But they all knew what happened to cattle in unheated barns at minus 40. They died. Marcus stood at the entrance looking out at white chaos. I spent my whole life believing I knew how to protect livestock. I have written guidelines for the association. I have judged other men's preparations and found them wanting. His voice was hollow. And here I am standing in a hay igloo I called madness this morning, watching it save cattle while proper barns collapse across the county. Pride isn't a sin when it's earned, Garrett said quietly. But weather doesn't care what we've earned. It only cares about what works. They stood in silence, listening to storm rage outside and cattle breathe peacefully within. Somewhere in darkness beyond the dome, Alberta was being reshaped by forces that respected neither tradition nor experience. Somewhere in that darkness, the difference between survival and disaster was being measured, not in strength of conventional wisdom, but in willingness to embrace knowledge that looked like madness. The night was far from over. At 3 in the morning, the storm reached its peak. Wind speeds hit 90 miles per hour. Temperature dropped to minus 47 degrees. Snow was falling so fast that Garrett's farmhouse was being buried, drifts reaching the second floor windows. Inside the dome, the cattle slept. Outside, the world was ending. Garrett stood at the entrance watching snow pile against the outer walls at alarming rates. For the first time since completing the structures, he felt genuine fear. Not for himself, he had stopped caring about his own survival the day Sarah died, but for the 52 animals depending on engineering he'd never tested in conditions this extreme. "What are you thinking?" Linnea asked softly, appearing beside him. "That I might have killed them all with arrogance," Garrett replied. "That maybe Marcus was right. Maybe this is just madness dressed up in mathematics. You don't believe that. I don't know what I believe anymore. I built these structures to honor Sarah's memory, to make sure no one else loses what I lost. But what if I'm wrong? What if 2 years of obsessive study was just grief pretending to be wisdom? Linnea placed her hand on his shoulder. Sarah would be proud of you. Sarah would be alive if I'd listened to her in the first place. Garrett's voice cracked. She told me the barn needed reinforcement. She said it gave her bad feelings. I told her she was being paranoid. I told her our barn was sound, that it had survived 20 winters, that I knew what I was doing. He turned to face Linnea, and she saw tears on his face for the first time since the funeral. I was wrong, and it killed her. And now I'm asking 52 cattle and 4 humans to trust in methods I've never tested because I'm too proud or too broken to admit I might be wrong again. Garrett, don't. He wiped his eyes. Just don't. If this works, it's because of Grandpa Ezra and an Inuit man named Tulimak, who I never met. If it fails, it's because I'm a fool who couldn't tell the difference between wisdom and grief. The wind screamed, the dome creaked, and somewhere in the darkness, they heard a sound that made everyone's blood run cold. The sharp crack of hay bales compressing under impossible weight. It's failing, Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. The structure's failing. Garrett grabbed a flashlight and ran deeper into the dome, checking the walls, the ceiling, the compression points where bales locked together. The others followed, watching him run his hands over the structure, pressing against walls, testing strength. It's not failing, he said finally. It's adapting. What? The sound we heard, that's compression settling. The bales are locking tighter under the snow load. The dome isn't collapsing. It's getting stronger. He pointed to where walls curved inward. Look at how the hay is compacting. See how each layer's being pressed more tightly against the one below. The storm isn't destroying the structure. It's reinforcing it, just like Grandpa Ezra said it would. And in that moment, standing in a hay dome while the worst storm in 50 years tried to tear it apart, Garrett Thorne finally understood what his grandfather had been trying to teach him. You don't survive winter by fighting it. You survive by understanding it well enough to make it work for you. The storm raged on, but inside the dome, the cattle slept peacefully. And for the first time in 2 years, Garrett Thorne allowed himself to hope. Dawn broke gray and silent across the Alberta prairie. Storm had exhausted itself just before sunrise, leaving behind a world transformed beyond recognition. Where fences stood, only tips of posts emerged from drifts, reaching 8, 10, sometimes 12 feet high. Where roads carved straight lines, there was now nothing but undulating white emptiness that erased all evidence of human geometry. Wind had stopped. In its absence, silence felt alive, pressing against eardrums, accustomed to hours of screaming chaos. Garrett was first outside, stepping into snow that reached his chest. Cold hit him like a physical blow, minus 42 degrees. Thermometer read, though still air made it almost bearable compared to wind chills they'd endured. He broke a path forward, each step requiring him to lift his leg high and stamp down packing snow enough to support weight. Behind him came Linnea, then Marcus, then Callum. None spoke. Words seemed inadequate. The landscape had been remade. Garrett's farmhouse stood like an island in a white ocean roof, barely visible above drifts piled against walls. His truck had disappeared, completely buried under a smooth mound, giving no indication of what lay beneath. Trees bordering his property had been transformed into abstract sculptures. Branches weighted with ice until they nearly touched ground. And the hay domes had vanished. Where structures stood, there were now only gentle hills of white curves in landscape that could have been natural formations carved by ancient glaciers. If you didn't know what you were looking for, you'd never guess that beneath those innocent-looking mounds, 52 head of cattle were sheltering in warmth and safety. Are they still there? Callum asked, voice tight with anxiety that hadn't diminished despite evidence they'd seen. Garrett knelt beside the largest mound and began digging with his hands, clearing snow until he found the entrance. The hay bale door was intact, sealed tight, showing no signs of structural failure. He pulled it open. Warm air rushed out, carrying with it earthy smell of cattle and hay, and something else, the smell of survival. Inside, cattle stood exactly as they had at 3 in the morning, calm, dry, healthy, some lying down chewing cud, others standing in small groups, breath visible in dim light filtering through ventilation pipes. Callum pushed past Garrett and waded in running hands over his cattle, with desperate relief of a father reunited with lost children. His injured cow wasn't just alive, but standing comfortably lacerated flank, showing clear signs of healing despite less than 24 hours passing. "This isn't possible," Callum whispered, but his hands kept moving, checking and rechecking, unable to believe what they were telling him. Linnea began taking photographs. The scientist in her was already documenting, thinking about reports she'd have to write, explanations she'd have to provide to colleagues who would never believe without evidence. Marcus stood silent in entrance, face unreadable. He pulled out his phone, made a call to his foreman. Conversation was brief. When he hung up, he looked older than 58. "Final count is 43% losses. Out of 120 head, we lost 52. He looked at Garrett's cattle, healthy and calm, then at his own phone as if it had betrayed him. "In one night, everything I built proved worthless." Garrett said nothing. Numbers spoke for themselves. 52 dead on Marcus's ranch, 52 alive on Garrett's. Linnea's phone began buzzing with messages. Cellular network struggling to come back online. What she read made her grip tighter. "It's worse than we thought. Official livestock death toll is over 3,000 head across the region. 23 barns completely destroyed, 41 with major structural damage." She looked up at Garrett. "They're calling it the worst agricultural disaster in Alberta history." She scrolled through more reports. Henderson family lost everything. 100% casualties. Barn collapsed in first hour. Callum made a sound that was half sob, half prayer. "That could have been me if you hadn't." He couldn't finish. He stood among his leaving cattle, surrounded by warmth in middle of devastation, and wept. 3 weeks later, Garrett's property looked like a construction site. Pickup trucks lined the driveway, license plates showing counties across Alberta and Saskatchewan. Men in heavy coats moved between demonstration models in various stages of completion, taking measurements, photographing from every angle. Garrett stood in the center, explaining for perhaps the 50th time how compression ratio worked, why dome shape was essential where ventilation pipes needed positioning. His voice was hoarse from days of teaching, but he continued patiently. Marcus Hicks was among his most dedicated students. The former association president arrived each morning at dawn, working alongside men half his age to master techniques that once seemed like madness. His own ranch was being completely rebuilt. Insurance settlement had been substantial, and he was investing every penny into hay dome construction. "Key is the angle," Garrett explained to visiting ranchers from Saskatchewan. "Every bale positioned at exactly 47 degrees relative to one below. Too steep, you lose structural integrity. Too shallow, you can't create air circulation that keeps interior warm." A young rancher raised his hand. "But won't hay compress under snow load and change angles?" "That's the beautiful part," Marcus answered before Garrett could. "Compression actually strengthens structure. Dome doesn't fight the weight it absorbs, it redistributes. It uses it to lock bales tighter. Storm doesn't destroy it. Storm makes it stronger." Garrett caught Marcus's eye and nodded. Transformation was complete. The man who ridiculed these structures was now their most eloquent advocate. But not everyone converted. 3 miles east, Harold Drummond stood in his intact barn surrounded by cattle that survived through combination of luck and stubbornness. His barn had held, though inspection revealed, stress fractures, requiring extensive repairs before next winter. Harold had been ranching 43 years. He'd seen fads come and go. He wasn't about to be convinced by one storm that everything he knew was suddenly wrong. "Hey, igloos," he muttered to his foreman Derek. What's next? Teaching cattle to build their own shelters. Derek, who'd attended Garrett's workshops, said nothing. He'd learned arguing with Harold was pointless, but Derek made a decision. When the ranch passed to him, first thing he'd do was tear down the barn and build hay domes. Some men learned from others' mistakes. Others had to make their own. Harold would be making his own next winter. Linnea emerged from Garrett's farmhouse carrying her laptop, face bright with excitement. It's official. University of Alberta wants to hire you as consultant. They're developing standardized protocols for what they're calling adaptive thermal shelters. $40,000 for 6 months. She pulled up an email. Plus they want to publish my report in Journal of Agricultural Engineering. They're calling it groundbreaking work on indigenous knowledge integration. Garrett stared at the screen reading numbers without quite believing them. 6 months ago, he'd been a pariah. Now universities wanted his expertise. Agricultural journals wanted his methods. Canadian government's agricultural department had reached out about including hay dome specifications in national guidelines. What do I tell them? Linnea asked. Garrett looked around his property. At ranchers learning, at demonstration domes taking shape, at Marcus helping a younger man position a bale with careful precision. Tell them yes, but tell them I'm not doing it for money. Then why? Garrett pulled the photograph from his shirt pocket, the one he'd carried every day for 2 years. Young Garrett and grandfather Ezra standing beside first hay dome, built in summer of 1990. Both smiling though old man's eyes held knowledge of catastrophes boy hadn't yet experienced. Because knowledge like this doesn't belong to one person. It belongs to everyone who needs it to survive. He paused. And because Sarah would have wanted me to help people. She always said I was too good at building walls around myself instead of bridges to others. His voice caught. Maybe this is my bridge. Maybe this is how I honor her memory, not by hiding in grief, but by making sure what happened to her doesn't happen to anyone else. Linnea placed her hand on his arm. She'd be proud of you. I hope so. God, I hope so. Callum Westridge stood in what used to be ruins of his family barn. Wreckage had been cleared weeks ago. In its place, 5 hay domes rose from prairie, like ancient cairns, curved walls, already weathering to blend with landscape. His cattle moved freely between structures, healthy and thriving. The cow with lacerated flank showed almost no scarring. Linnea remarked that stress-free environment promoted healing at rates defying conventional expectations. Insurance settlement covered barn cost and then some. Callum had taken that money and invested entirely in hay dome construction. 5 structures instead of one traditional barn. The math was simple. 5 domes cost less than 1 barn, provided superior protection could be built in fraction of the time. But more than economics, Callum had learned something about wisdom itself. His grandfather built the barn that collapsed. His father maintained it. Callum himself trusted it completely, believing 3 generations of knowledge couldn't be wrong. Storm taught him that 3 generations of knowledge meant nothing if those generations never faced conditions you were about to endure. His phone rang. Insurance agent calling about premium adjustments. So because I'm using hay domes instead of traditional shelter, my livestock insurance premium is being reduced by 30%. Agent confirmed. Insurance companies analyzed storm data, saw which structures failed, which survived, ran actuarial calculations, and reached inescapable conclusion: hay domes represented lower risk. Economics was finally catching up to engineering. On a clear April morning, when last snow had melted and prairie was beginning to show hints of green, Garrett stood beside his largest hay dome and placed his hand against weathered hay. Structure had survived not just the storm, but months that followed, proven itself through freeze-thaw cycles that could tear apart poorly constructed buildings. Cattle were out grazing now, healthy and fat winter coats already shedding. In a few weeks, they'd be moved to summer pasture, and hay domes would stand empty until next autumn. Garrett pulled out the photograph one more time. Ezra Thorne, standing beside young Garrett, both building something that looked crazy but worked. Old man's smile seemed to carry approval across decades. He walked to the small cemetery at edge of his property, where two headstones stood side by side. Ezra Thorne, born 1931, died 2013. Beloved grandfather survivor teacher Sarah Thorne, born 1978, died 2023. Beloved wife taken too soon, never forgotten. Garrett knelt between the stones. Snow was finally gone, revealing fresh grass beginning to grow. Spring returning, life continuing. "We survived," he said softly. "The methods worked, the cattle lived. 52 head made it through the worst storm in 50 years, and not one of them died because I was too stubborn to learn." His voice broke. "I couldn't save you, Sarah. I failed you. I trusted conventional wisdom, and it killed you, and I'll carry that for the rest of my life. But I won't let it happen again. I won't let anyone else lose what I lost, because they didn't know there was a better way." He placed the photograph between headstones, securing it with stone. "Grandpa Ezra, you were right. About everything. About building for the world that is instead of the world we want. About doing what works even when it looks insane. About remembering that the people we love are worth more than opinions of people who don't understand." Wind whispered through grass, carrying with it smell of approaching spring and distant rain. "I'm going to teach them, Grandpa. Anyone who wants to learn, I'm going to make sure your wisdom doesn't die with me. That Tulimak's knowledge doesn't get lost again. That what you and the Inuit people preserved through generations of survival gets passed on to everyone who needs it." He stood, wiping tears from his face. "And Sarah, I'm going to try to be the man you believed I could be. The one who builds bridges instead of walls, who helps instead of hides. It won't bring you back. Nothing will, but maybe it'll mean something. Maybe it'll be enough." Thunder rumbled in distance. Spring rain coming to wash away last traces of winter. Garrett walked back toward his house, where Linnea was waiting with contracts to sign and plans to review. Where the future was beginning, built on foundation of past. Where knowledge earned in blood and grief was being transformed into wisdom that could save lives. 6 months later, November 2026. First snow of new season fell on a November evening. Gentle flakes promising nothing like catastrophe they'd endured year before. All across Clearwater County, ranchers watched snow and felt hearts beat just a little faster, remembering. But this year was different. This year, landscape was dotted with hay domes instead of traditional barns. This year, knowledge that nearly been lost had been preserved and shared and multiplied. Marcus Hicks stood beside his newly constructed domes, watching cattle file inside with same calm instinct Garrett's herd had shown. He pulled out his phone, sent message to Ranchers Association group chat. First snow, all cattle sheltered, hay domes performing as expected. Garrett Thorne was right. We were wrong. Never forget that. Responses flooded in. Agreements, testimonials, photographs of successful dome constructions across 3 provinces. Transformation was complete, but not everywhere. Harold Drummond stood in his barn, now heavily reinforced support beams, replaced roof, restructured. He'd spent $30,000 making it storm-proof. His cattle were inside heating lamps, glowing traditional shelter humming with generators. "See," he said to Derek, "my way works just fine." Derek said nothing. He was thinking about the insurance premium. Harold was paying 40% higher than ranchers using hay domes. Thinking about the electricity costs for heating and generators. Thinking about what would happen if power failed like it had last year. Thinking about the ranch he'd inherit someday, and the first thing he'd do with it. Outside, snow continued to fall. Not heavy, not dangerous. Just winter returning to Alberta as it always did, testing the wisdom of men who thought they could control it. 300 miles north in a small Inuit community, an elderly man named Tulimak turned on his television and watched a news report about revolutionary rancher who saved Alberta's cattle industry using indigenous techniques. A reporter interviewed Garrett, asked where he learned such innovative methods. Garrett held up photograph of young Garrett and Ezra, explained about his grandfather and Inuit traders, who saved a desperate man's life by teaching him to work with winter instead of against it. My grandfather learned from your people, Garrett told the camera, from a man named Tulimak, who showed him that survival isn't about fighting the elements. It's about understanding them well enough to make them work for you. Everything I built, everything that saved 52 cattle last winter, it all comes from wisdom your people preserved for thousands of years. He paused, and his voice grew thick with emotion. I lost my wife because I trusted methods that weren't designed for the world we live in now. But I won't let anyone else lose what I lost. This knowledge, your knowledge, belongs to everyone who needs it to survive. Tulimak smiled. He was the grandson of the Tulimak who taught Ezra Thorne in 1972. His grandfather had died believing that knowledge had been lost, that southern people would never embrace methods so different from their traditions. But knowledge has a way of surviving. It hibernates in photographs and memories, and hands of desperate men willing to build things that look like madness. It waits for the moment when it's needed most, then resurfaces with all force of wisdom whose time has finally come. Tulimak turned off television and walked outside into falling snow. Somewhere to south cattle were sleeping warm in hay domes, built on principles his ancestors perfected over millennia. Somewhere to south, men who ridiculed those principles were now teaching them to their children. The knowledge had come home, not to north where it was born, but to hearts of everyone who needed it to survive. And that Tulimak knew was exactly as it should be. He looked up at falling snow and whispered blessing in his grandfather's language. For Ezra Thorne, who had been willing to learn. For Garrett Thorne, who had been willing to remember through his grief. For Sarah Thorne, whose death became catalyst for saving thousands of lives. For all the desperate men in all the harsh winters who would find salvation in knowledge that had been waiting for them all along. Snow continued to fall, gentle and steady, blanketing north in white. And somewhere in that vastness, wisdom of survival passed from one generation to next, from one people to another, flowing like water, to wherever it was needed most. Because that is what wisdom does. It survives, it adapts, it saves those willing to learn, and it never ever forgets. Epilogue. Spring 2027. On a warm spring day, Garrett Thorne stood before 200 agricultural students at University of Alberta teaching his first official class as visiting professor of indigenous agricultural practices. Behind him, projected on screen, was photograph of young Garrett and grandfather Ezra. Beside it, thermal imaging of hay dome interior during storm. And beside that photograph of Sarah Thorne, smiling in their barn 2 weeks before she died. This is my wife Sarah, Garrett told the students. She died because I was too arrogant to admit that methods I'd always used weren't good enough anymore. She died because I trusted tradition over truth, because I thought being right was more important than being willing to learn. His voice was steady now. 2 years of teaching had given him practice in sharing this story without breaking. Everything I'm going to teach you today, everything about hay, dome construction, thermal dynamics, indigenous knowledge integration, all of it exists because I failed someone I loved. Because my grandfather taught me wisdom I didn't appreciate until it was too late. Because an Inuit man named Tulimak showed a desperate rancher that survival comes from humility, not pride. He clicked to next slide. Satellite image of Clearwater County showing hundreds of hay domes dotting landscape where traditional barns used to stand. This is what wisdom looks like when we're finally willing to listen, when we're finally desperate enough to admit that people who survived things we've never faced might know things we need to learn. A student raised her hand. Professor Thorne, do you think traditional barns will disappear completely? Garrett thought of Harold Drummond, still stubbornly maintaining his reinforced barn, still paying higher insurance premiums, still risking everything on methods that had already failed once. No, he said honestly. There will always be people who resist change, who believe that admitting you were wrong is worse than being wrong. And some of them will get lucky. Their barns will hold, their cattle will survive, and they'll use that as proof they were right all along. He paused. But others won't be lucky, and they'll learn the hard way what I learned, that the price of stubbornness is sometimes higher than we're willing to pay. The lecture continued for another hour. Engineering principles, construction protocols, ventilation mathematics, all the technical knowledge that turned grief into wisdom, failure into salvation. But what the students would remember most was the photograph of Sarah Thorne smiling in a barn that would kill her loved by a man who learned too late that being willing to change is sometimes the greatest act of love we can offer. When class ended, Garrett walked to cemetery where Sarah and Ezra waited. Spring flowers were blooming on their graves now, life returning to places touched by death. I taught 200 students today, he told Sarah. 200 people who will build hay domes instead of traditional barns. Who will remember that indigenous knowledge isn't primitive, it's proven. That survival comes from humility, not pride. He placed fresh flowers on her grave. I couldn't save you, but maybe I've saved others. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's how love survives death, by becoming wisdom that protects people we'll never meet. Wind carried his words across prairie, scattering them like seeds. And somewhere in that vastness, in the space between grief and wisdom, between loss and learning, between one winter and the next, Sarah Thorne smiled. Because love that becomes knowledge never really dies. It just changes form and keeps saving lives forever.